We talked about resting potential, depolarization, repolarization, refractory repair, all that jazz. But really what's going on is that impulse is traveling down. I told you we talked about nodes of Ranvier in just a minute, and that's this. So the myelin sheath has little openings on each one of it. And the reason is so that charge can jump and it can be quick. So you'll have these nodes in areas that need to be extremely quick, and that's muscle contraction. You don't need to think about and slowly contract in skeletal muscle. So you'll have nodes of Ranvier there for sure. Quick. Something came in here and someone came in here and tried to shoot us, we would need to be able to react very quickly. So you're going to have something like this in your skeletal muscle. Whereas glands or stomach, where we're secreting hydrochloric acid, there's no rush on that. So we don't have to have those nodes. It doesn't have to move as quickly. Another term for nerve impulse, that's where it's actually moving down. So it's not the depolarization, but action potential. That's when it's rushing all the way down. So this one here is repolarization, but here's action potential. Depolarizing can be just one section, and if it doesn't meet that threshold, then it'll stop right there. But if it does meet that threshold, then it will wave on down that axon. So that's your action potential, is an actual impulse moving all the way down. Action potential. Okay, so we have seen something like this before, except for we had a neuron on this side, and it was actually a motor neuron that we were talking about. And then over here we had a muscle. So you've seen this before, but now we're talking from one neuron to another neuron. So like a nerve is a bunch of neurons all lined up together, all speaking to each other. So this neuron, we had that action potential come down, or that nerve impulse come down, and it causes calcium to flood inside that, and this would be one synaptic knob or axon terminal. One synaptic knob. Calcium rushes in, and when it does, it causes these vesicles, it causes a reaction to them, so they move. So they move closer to that membrane of that axon terminal or synaptic knob, and they release their neurotransmitters. So here, you could be talking about epinephrine or norepinephrine. We've talked about those. Other ones, dopamine is one. But we'll talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine. So those neurotransmitters are chemicals, because this is electrical coming down here. But then we need a chemical messenger to send that on to the next one, to create another electrical impulse to rush down. Epinephrine or norepinephrine will connect to those receptors, and when it does, it causes a reaction. And that's that action potential then can go to the next one. So we started out with dendrites over here, going to the cell body, down the axon, to the synaptic knob. Then we connect to another dendrite, cell body, axon. We'll build some things and we'll get those down. Dendrite, cell body, axon in the next day or two. Neurotransmitter connects to the receptors, creates that action potential, and then this is just like what we were talking about, where sodium's on the outside, potassium's on the inside. They switch, and we get an action potential. So that's just showing sodium coming on in. Now, electrical impulses, if we keep those attached there, then we're going to keep getting some electrical impulses. So you have what is called acetylcholine esterase that comes in here and chomps away those neurotransmitters and sends them on, so it'll stop. So they're actually stopping that action potential from keep occurring. Okay, So now we're getting away from the central nervous system where we were talking about brain, spinal cord. Now spinal cord, anything outside of that, we have spinal cord nerves that come outside of the spinal cord. They are not central nervous system. They're considered peripheral nervous system now. Spinal cord is central, but anything branching off of it and coming out of it is going to be peripheral. So we've got cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and we'll talk about those all in just a minute and the different, how many we have in each one and all that jazz. So your spinal cord. So this is taking a spinal cord here, severing it, doing a transverse section of it, and flipping it up so you're looking at. So this would be towards your belly side, and this is going to be your back side. So if you were to bow over and feel those ridges in your back, that's going to be these horns back here, those bony prominences on your back. So right there in the middle is where you're going to find your spinal cord. So the body of the vertebrae, they're going to protect that spinal cord as well as their weight bearing. They're very solid, thick. They can handle a lot of weight. The back side, there again, to protect that spinal cord. So the main thing, our spinal cord here, we have what is called gray matter and white matter. And you find this in the brain as well, which we'll do on next lecture. We'll talk about the brain. But the gray matter, here is where you're going to find all your cell bodies. So, and when we're talking about cell bodies, you're talking about the cell bodies of a neuron. So a bunch of those guys is what you'll find in the gray matter, cell bodies. And then out here, you're going to see your axons in that white matter. Inside the very center of that spinal cord, you have what's called a central canal, and that's where that cerebral spinal fluid can go down the middle of it, and then it can go around the spinal cord as well. So it'll flow down the middle, and then it'll bathe around it. You see here in that open spaces is where you're going to find cerebral spinal fluid, kind of the blue here. You do need to know the difference between a posterior horn and an anterior horn. So you do have a right and a left to it. So posterior, towards the back side, this is your dorsal fin here. Posterior horn, you have where we have sensory information coming in. If you can think of some way to memorize posterior means sensory and anterior means motor, then figure that out. Because you do have to know posterior backside is where all the sensory neurons and nerves come in and speak to the backside of that spinal cord. And then we'll go out front side, anterior, that's going to be motor, taking information out. You'll have a ganglion on that posterior part of the tract that's coming in. This posterior is a bunch of cell bodies again. They're all bunched together. So these neurons out here are going to be peripheral, whereas the neurons inside here in the spinal cord are going to be central. Anything outside of this guy is peripheral nervous system. Epidural space is important. So when you're thinking about people getting an epidural for, say, labor and delivery, then that's the space that they're actually injecting in and then deadening, not really deadening, but anesthetizing those nerves that are there. So anything below that will be kind of put to sleep. And so they're not actually going into the spinal cord, they're going into this space right here and injecting fluid.
So it doesn't hurt as bad as like a spinal tap?
Spinal tap's the same thing, except you're removing fluid. This you're adding medication. Spinal taps you're removing fluid.
The numbing part is the worst than the actual epidural. The numbing shot.
Yeah,
They needed it.
they usually are. Okay, so with that being said, you have some membranes that we're going to see again when we talk about the brain. But looking at the spinal cord, you have actually three membranes. Pia mater sits right on top of the spinal cord. That's the same with the brain. And then you have an arachnoid mater. An arachnoid sounds like what? Spiders. So spiders make what? Webs. And it does look, this is a pretty fragile kind of membrane too, but it does make webbing appearance inside there. So you'll have a pia mater, and then on the very out you have a dura mater, and in the middle you have this webbing arachnoid mater. What is important is that's where the cerebral spinal fluid is in that what's called a subarachnoid space. That's where you find cerebral spinal fluid. The very durable part is the dura mater. That's the wrapping around it that's really strong. So really fragile, web-like. Pia mater sits right on top. Pia mater is important because that's where you find all your blood vessels so that are nourishing that spinal cord. We got to bring oxygen and nutrients to the spinal cord, and then we got to remove those waste products. So that's what the pia mater's for. Dorsal root, again, going in, bringing sensory information into the spinal cord, and then coming out, we have our ventral, we have the efferent coming out, bringing information to the muscles or glands. Motor coming out. Sensory in, dorsal, backside. Remember, that's our vertebrae back there, that dorsal root. So a dorsal root. And then ventral or motor coming in the front side, belly side. Ganglion is just a bunch of cell bodies sitting there. Okay, so if we're talking peripheral, out here I have nerves. So I have motor and sensory nerves as well as mixed. Mixed nerves they can relay motor and sensory back and forth. So they're the same things when they're in the central nervous system, so spinal cord, except for we name them differently. They're not nerves now, they're called tracts. Because if we called it nerves, then you wouldn't know where we're talking about. Are we talking about peripheral nervous system, or are we talking about central nervous system? If you're talking tracts, then you know we're talking about central nervous system. You went way back. Okay. So it still is a bunch of sensory neurons lined up or a bunch of motor neurons lined up. So sensory neurons, we would going ascending tract would be going up. Efferent tract would be going down, motor. Dorsal, and don't worry about the spinal thalamic tracts and all those. I'm not going to have you learn those. So, spinal nerves, if we say nerves, we are not inside the spinal cord. It's the ones that are branching off. So, these are going to take information to the spinal cord or away from the spinal cord. And then the spinal cord will decide if it needs to go all the way up to the brain or down. Depending on some things, you'll see in just a minute, go spinal cord and back out. They don't even go to the brain. So, the things like me raising my hand or me holding my hand up and it gets tired, sensory would be the sensation of my muscles are weakening. They send that spinal sends that ascending tract, will send it, or dorsal tract, going up to the brain. The brain says, well, hello, dummy, lower your arm. And that will send that down efferent tract or ventral root tract down. And tells me to lower my arm. So that stuff does go to the brain. You'll see in a minute we don't send everything to the brain. Some things we don't need to think about. We have seen something very similar to this before when we were talking about muscles. Remember, we had those fascicles. We'll put those together and create, finally, a big bundle, and that big bundle creates a muscle. We took a bunch of little bundles and put them all together. Well, here you have your axons. We have cell bodies and axons, but here's really long axons. We put all those together, and you create one fascicule. So one fascicule will take a bunch of fascicules, so that's a bunch of bundles of axons, and create a nerve. Just like we did with muscles. So those nerves coming off the spinal cord, you're going to have 4 pairs off the cervical. Then you're going to have 6 pairs off the thoracic. And then we're going to end up with 4 pairs coming off of that lumbar. And some of them one of them is considered in the sacral plexus as well. And then we'll have a 5 sacral and a coccygeal. So, nerves, anywhere through there, you can have some issues. If you have vertebrae sitting here, they're coming in between those spaces from the vertebrae. So, if you ever have any crushing and then we have disc, remember, if you have anything that is putting pressure